Welcome to the Stray Pointers podcast, where seemingly ordinary people join us for extraordinary discussions. You're listening to Season 2, Episode 9 of the Stray Pointers podcast. This episode was recorded on April 3rd, 2024. I'm your host, Jim Lawless. For more information about the show, including the show notes for this episode, please visit straypointers.com. Joining the show tonight is software engineer, musician, and illustrator Gunnar Gustafson. Gunnar, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jim. It's a privilege.
Hey, Gunnar, I saw a LinkedIn post of yours a couple weeks ago where you mentioned a couple things that caught my eye. One of which, you basically began the post by saying you were covering 25 years as a JavaScript engineer. And you said in 1999, my first year of college at 15 years old, and you continued for a bit, but you really caught my attention with starting college at 15. Now, I know you're a longtime software engineer. You've got a background as a musician, as an illustrator. Well, can we talk a little bit about your early years and what led up to you attending college at 15 years old?
Yeah. It sounds a lot more impressive than it actually is. Uh, I was born in Las Vegas, Nevada, and I remember like when I moved away, and it was the first big business meeting I had. I had spoken with the head of marketing, and she asked, "Oh, where were you from?" And she's like, "Oh, I'm from Las Vegas." And she stops and says, "No one's from Las Vegas." Like, and that kind of in a nutshell explains the opportunities that were available to me. It's funny when I was born, Las Vegas wasn't a very large town. There was like one women's hospital, and my wife and I were actually delivered by the same nurse practitioner. We were looking at our birth certificates. I was like, "That's the same person." And yeah, like a lot of people weren't born there. And throughout my life, it grew, mainly because people were leaving Los Angeles. Um, but Las Vegas didn't have a ton of opportunities. It wasn't exactly a great school district. And when I was a kid, I remember my mom actually petitioned to open up two new schools in the district that I was zoned for. And they opened up one school, and that wasn't enough. So they petitioned again. They opened up another school. So I went to an elementary school where grades K through 3 were on one side of the street, and then grades 4 through 5 were on the other side of the street. They actually had to build two schools right next to each other to accommodate the number of students. But I had a hard time at school. Funny enough, I think the teachers had a hard time figuring out what to do with me. And that was always the case. I remember always getting marked by saying, "Oh, he's got such a great imagination, but he's always daydreaming." Um, and it led to a certain point where one teacher was just overly concerned, and it led me to be tested. And I actually found out that now I would be classified as autistic, but back then it was Asperger's. And it was fascinating. I got held back at least once. My parents got really frustrated with public school, so they enrolled me in a private school. And it was a brand new set of problems. Yes, I got more attention, but I just didn't gel well with the students that were going there. And again, they were going to hold me back again, just because I was bored. I just wasn't entertained. So my parents brought me to another specialist for testing, and they said, let's just try something. Let's get Gunnar assessed. and I went through an assessment process where they essentially placed me at a high school level. And they told me, well, the school district doesn't have a program set up for you. So you can go to a homeschool if you want and focus on working at your own pace, and you'll go in like weekly for testing and reassessment. So I did that when I was 12, did that for about 3 years, had earned enough credits to complete high school at 15. And then I started magnet programs at a community college when I turned 15. Basically, didn't take any breaks. So it went from me um, feeling like I was behind my peers to all of a sudden like, well, okay, I guess I'm leaving my peers behind and I'm going off to do my own thing. But really, I don't think it was because I was more intelligent. I just think it was more because the school district had a really hard time figuring out what to do with me. um, but it's funny because I now there are so many great programs to include children with learning disabilities in the classroom, kind of keeping them in the pace. And I feel like if I were to do it again, I would just like to go through the normal high school experience, and not
Sure,
start college at 15.
sure. We're certainly going to get into talking about tech, but another thing that has been prevalent in your life, as nearly as I can tell, is music. So
Hmm.
when did the music bug bite you? And can you give me a little bit of your background as a listener and as a performer?
Yeah. Music was a great way to stay off the streets. Um, I grew up again in Las Vegas, North Las Vegas specifically. Neighborhood I grew up in, there was Nellis Air Force Base to the east, a pig farm to the west, and a bunch of warehouses to the north. Um, so there wasn't a whole heck of a lot to do in that city. Um, and when I became a young man, a teenager, I just was not into the things that other kids were doing. I wanted to. I've always kind of uh, had more of an intellectual side to me. I was happier reading books. I was happier um, kind of exploring things that I could get direct feedback from. And I remember when I was really little, around 8, my parents had got me a Casio keyboard. It was one of those cheap electronic keyboards, and it was a Casio SK1, and it was set up to where you could record samples and play them back on keys. And I would just go around the house like sampling things. I would sample the dishwasher, is the 90s dishwasher made an awful racket, and I could record that and play it back. And I would just spend a lot of time doodling around with this little synthesizer and sampler. And eventually I got into a storage closet somewhere and found my mom's old classical guitar, and I asked my mom if I could have it, and she was just thrilled. She was absolutely beside herself. She was always a big fan of Segovia and Julian Bream, and she wanted me to take um, Spanish guitar lessons, and I did that for a little while. And then when I was around 13, I decided, I want to be in charge of the instruments I play. So I started playing bass, um, and kind of experimenting a little bit more with electronic music. Um, and it stayed with me. I actually took a lot of courses at my community college for business of music and technology, and I have certifications in audio engineering and the business of music.
Well, very good.
So, yeah, it was, and that was fun. The business of music technology course was taught by a guy named Marty Sloan, which is like the most music business name ever. He was the road manager for the Temptations,
Oh, is that
and he
right?
was hilarious. Yeah, he was a great guy. I really enjoyed learning business from him.
Hmm.
Um, and just a really fun character. You know, it's like someone obviously dreamt him up. Like he would. It almost seemed like he wasn't real. He was just way too showbiz to be real, but he was. And I learned an awful lot from him. And then yeah, later on, I kind of it segued into engineering. You know, my interest in music, my interest in art. Um, the world was just way too small for me as a young man. I didn't have a tribe, so to speak, where I lived. It was hard for me to connect with folks who, because my interests are pretty esoteric. You know, I love analog synthesizers and I love uh, really weird recording techniques. So it was hard for me to connect with others, and I found like message boards and forums on the early days of the internet that allowed me to connect with others. And eventually that led to me kind of developing ideas between art and music and writing, and really writing my own websites and applications. Getting into Flash early on was a big leap for me, getting into programming because Flash utilizes a lot of programming. It had a script interface that you could use called Actionscript, and you'd be able to interact with, in the old days of Flash, you had these great macromedia uh, timelines where you could create a canvas and you could orchestrate what was happening on the timelines. But there was only so much you could do. So if you really wanted to get in there and customize things, you had to open up ActionScript and you'd have to program queues for different things to work. You know, so Flash was interactive. So if you wanted to make a game or put in points of your animation that you wanted the user to interact with, that was a great way to do it.
Was this your first exposure to programming then?
No, my dad was actually a COBOL developer. He started his career in 1964 with Wells Fargo, funny enough. So I guess that would make me a second generation fintech developer.
Okay, sure, sure.
But yeah, he was always encouraging me and my sisters to experiment. Like we had a home computer around when I was 9, and he told me if I wanted to use it, I had to learn how to run DOS programs. So that was my first introduction to working with computers and programming. Um, and then when the internet kind of hit, it was like, oh, great, I can use this to communicate with people. And that's what I did. And that was before the days of social media. I had chat programs like Yahoo, AOL Instant Messenger, where I could kind of join chat rooms and learn from others, and on a broad range of concepts, right? Like not just music and writing or art. I would talk with people on how to refine my approach with Flash and building websites. And eventually, it was great. You could, back in the day, there were these services like Geocities or Angel Fire where you could get a free FTP. And really, all you had to do is make sure that you had the FTP client and all the files generated, and you just push them out to the client, and there you go. Your ideas are out there in the world, you know. And that's kind of that was enough incentive for me to connect with others and get my ideas out there and be responsible for my ideas. That's what really appealed to me.
Was any of your ActionScript Flash training, or was any of your education there done in a formal curriculum, or was this all kind of self-taught?
Yeah, yeah. When I started college, um, I really didn't want to know what I wanted to do, to be honest. Like I knew I wanted to be an artist at that point in my life because I loved art. It was my entire life. It was the way I kind of escaped what was around me. Um, so I naturally spent a lot of time in it. Uh, but I couldn't see myself making a living at it either. So when I first started college, I started in media arts and actually specialized in print. Around that time, I realized that print would no longer be a viable option for me to earn a living. So I specialized in web, and that's where I learned a lot about Flash, action scripts, building websites and deploying them. That gave me uh, a lot of information, and that I bolstered that, of course, with going on to message boards and utilizing chats. Like you used to be able to go on to Yahoo Chat, join a chat room, and they had these structured chat rooms where you talk about anything, like music, any topic of music. I actually met my wife on an industrial music chat room. So industrial music is one of my favorite genres. But yeah, back in the day, I remember it was really hard to connect with others, and yeah, I found out, funny enough, that her and I went to the same high school, that same homeschool program, and
Wow.
that's how we kind of kicked it off. But yeah, it was back in the early days of the internet. It seemed like it was a lot easier to actually connect with others. Like if people wanted to be on the internet, they really had to try to be on the internet. It wasn't as widespread. So you could go onto a Yahoo chat room and it would be specifically talking about something like, hey, I'm building this new Flash animation. Can you help me out? And there were all these other kind of independent websites. I remember there was Camp Chaos and Newgrounds were really great resources for independent creators to kind of get together and share ideas and share content. And that's just how you did it. Like I remember my early website that I did, where I had a bunch of Flash games and animations that I had made. You used to be able to come up with a friends list, a bunch of links to your friends. And I remember, Camp Chaos was one of the bigger ones back in the day. And I had messaged him and gotten in contact with him, and I asked him, hey, could you put a link to my site on your site, and I'll do the same for me. And he did it, and that drew some traffic to my early site. And same thing with Newgrounds. Newgrounds, you could just upload your content. That you take your Flash files, you upload it, they would moderate it, approve it, and it would go out, and you get connected that way. So back in the early days of the internet, I would say that it was more conducive to communicate with others than it is now. Because now you're pretty much everyone's on it, and those algorithms kind of create these spots of isolation in communities. So funny enough, rather than expanding your scope of the world, I feel now the scope is much more limited. People only see what the social media companies want them to see.
So tell me then, when did JavaScript enter your radar?
You it was always on there. When you write code for websites, right? You have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Like that's the stack. And two of those are interpreted languages. The other one is a script. So, it's kind of funny when you think about it today and just how far JavaScript has progressed. It's it's kind of like a loaded topic. Some people, they hear like the word JavaScript developer and they think like, oh, that's an oxymoron. The JavaScript isn't a real language. And to some degree, I kind of agree with that because in the early days, JavaScript really sucked to work with. I remember I've always been a tinkerer. I like to take things apart and figure out how they work. My parents would learn pretty early on, don't buy him anything that requires power and does not make noise because he'll take it apart. And I actually did that with one of the keyboards that they bought me, and they were livid. But that was always something I did. And that's one of the things that appealed to me about web development in particular is that everything was open. Like you could load a website and you just view source and bang, there it was. Everything's right there. And even when I was experimenting around with Flash and kind of trying to get my name out there on all these little websites and the buddy list, um, the thing that really stood out to me was how you integrate those Flash players with a web page. And you had to use at least some manner of JavaScript to get the window to interact with the player.
Okay.
Um, so, there was one really cool website for a video game that was pretty popular at the time called Black and White, which is a lot of fun. You get to play a deity and you have like an avatar walk around. The avatars are like really huge in the scenery. So you go to their website, and one of the things that they had done is they played like this audio file, these heavy footsteps coming closer. And then eventually the whole browser window shook. And I thought, wow, that's really cool. I wish I could figure out how to do that. So I cracked it open, and that was the first time I really played around with JavaScript. It was nice because, I mean, back in the day, people weren't minifying things. They weren't obfuscating their code. So you could read the code as the developer originally wrote it. And it was easier for me to understand at that point. But as soon as I branched out, there were all these things that you needed to learn because JavaScript didn't run the same way on everybody's browsers, right? And that was the case for the longest time. And that's why Flash was so cool. You could get, Flash really, when you get down to it, it was a terrible user experience, right? Because you had to have Flash downloaded and installed on your computer. So it was running real close to your OS. And the same thing with Internet Explorer, it was running real close to your OS. But they were separate. You had an embedded player inside the web page. They weren't actually utilizing the client or any of the client's memory. That was just right there running on your OS. So kind of a security issue. If you didn't have Flash installed, you couldn't use the Flash player. If you tried to play a Flash file that was too new, you had to update Flash. And back in the day before, broadband, when people were on 56K modems, that was like asking them to stop their whole day and update Flash.
Sure.
So, you know, I can understand why Flash was on its way out to begin with, but smartphones really did away with Flash. And for the longest time, like I didn't really start writing professionally because there was, that big .com crash and you couldn't get a job. So I freelanced here and there. I would play in bands or I'd have friends who played in bands and they'd be like, hey, can you build a website so we can post our shows where we're going to play at? And here's like a clip from one of our songs. Can you put it on the web page? And yeah, you would do that, and it would use that embedded media player. Again, you have to have it on your computer and play media through the browser. But one day, I thought, with YouTube being around and all these really cool embed scripts sitting around, maybe I could figure out how to make the experience less clunky. And I tried to get an embedded media player working on my band's website, and I just had a terrible experience with it. Learning languages before Stack Overflow and before all of these great utilities, you had to open a textbook. You had to troubleshoot. And there wasn't really a great way to put breakpoints in on the browser. So the entry point of learning code and making that code elegant in the browser just was not, it wasn't as enjoyable as working in Flash when you have the Flash editor. and you have Actionscript, and you have all these great tools to debug inside the editor. So, Flash, it was just, it was easier. It was me being lazy and figuring out how I could do all this great functionality with one tool. And JavaScript just was not ready for a bulk of functionality. I mean, you had to think about other things that were at play. Like Firefox was really just a thing, right? Before that, you had browsers that were super close to the OS. Java was separate, Flash was separate. Everything was using a lot of resources on the machine, and you had reduced bandwidth to add to that. So you couldn't, if websites weren't like really flashy unless you had a big Flash file on there. And you had to hope that your visitors were patient enough to get there and use it. And when search engines kind of became a bigger thing, right? Like Google really took off and people were starting to focus on SEO. That was another nail in the Flash coffin, right? Because you can't crawl a Flash file, you can't get data from a Flash file. So again, like you saw all these little events coming up into the death of Flash, and you could do a lot with Flash, like everything from drop downs were big. You could do, I remember slideshows. I built so many of those in my career. It's insane. Or even like embedded videos or interactive things like that. That was what Flash was used for. So once I started kind of working professionally as a front end developer, that was really me trying to survive a bad economy, right? I finally got a job, and that job was being a designer, right? And being support, project manager. I had to wear all the hats because that was also around the time the recession hit. And if I wanted my projects to kind of move along, I had to learn how to integrate them. I had to learn how to code. I had to learn how to facilitate the client's ask.
Let me ask that, did server-side coding come into your tool belt at this time?
Oh yeah, yeah. There were PHP was really popular around that time. In fact, there was a open source platform called Magento, which I believe eBay acquired. And it's still a thing, but it was a PHP based cart platform. And for the most part, it was bespoke. You could install it on any server and it would run. But there would be some customizations that you'd have to make with PHTML, and kind of interact with server bindings and go throughout the whole stack. But I never really messed around too much with the databases, because they were super fragile. Like e-commerce databases have a lot of lookups. They're not simple at all. Like there's SKU associations, inventory, all those things. Magento was a very uh, hungry application when it came to data. But we did have to mess around with that. And back in the day, like if you wanted to build your markup, you had to build it on the server, right? Like it's the whole DOM thing, right? Like when SEO became a big thing because you needed that DOM to be loaded, and it had to have enough plain text in there for the bots to be able to extract that data and get it into their algorithms, kind of build a presence for yourself. And I remember search engine optimization was a huge part of that. Everything was server rendered back in the day. But you would have limited functionality. Like if you did have Flash, it was like a little slideshow that showed like all your products or whatever. But you didn't see a lot of JavaScript get utilized for interactive functionality.
Now that changed.
Um,
That
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 did.
that changed. When do you think JavaScript matured enough that it started to become this thing that was in favor for those types of
jQuery.
things?
Yeah, it was.
Okay.
I would say jQuery is very much so responsible for JavaScript becoming as popular as it did. Because you got to remember, if you wanted something to work, you had to test it cross browser. You had to essentially write the code 4 times over, and you had to troubleshoot it, and you had to put on these shims and polyfills. It was a horrible experience. You couldn't get the same thing to work between Internet Explorer and Mozilla and Chrome. And then the other thing to really think about is like around that period of time, HTML5 became a thing, right? And CSS3. Those are big significant changes because before that, HTML and CSS was a static language, right? They would do a new version every once in a while, but they would not create a living standard around these utilities. And after HTML5, CSS3, everything just became a living standard. It became progressively enhanced. And a lot of that had to do with the Chromium browsers and Trident browsers, right? Mozilla and Google Chrome. And we still have this elephant in the room, which is Internet Explorer, right? Which is the bane of every front end developer's existence. Like, how do you get all these different browsers that sit either really close or far away from the OS, have all these different security requirements? How do you get them to behave the same way with a script language? Well, there were two libraries out there, and one was jQuery and the other one was MooTools. And there were other things out there that were kind of bridging on the same thing, like DHTML was kind of popular for a little while. But the idea there was that you wanted to create a plugin based a kind of like front end infrastructure that allowed you to have all of these different methods that were already polyfilled, like they just worked between browsers. And you could write the code once and it would work, but there was and that really appealed to front end developers too, because front end developers are not back end developers. They never were. There was a divide between the two. Front end developers at that point with HTML5 and CSS3 became very focused on semantics, because that was also like a big push for accessibility, to be more to have a more inclusive web experience. You saw libraries like Bootstrap came out around the same time, and CSS frameworks they didn't exist. That was an amazing idea, the concept that you could just build things quickly. But those CSS frameworks did include a dependency for jQuery and another library called Popper, which is used for positioning elements on the screen. After smartphones came around, that was it. Flash was done. Responsive web design became more popular. With the responsive web design, you needed a way to be able to manipulate the DOM and introduce elements and make things more navigable on a smaller screen. So I think that's when you saw JavaScript really blow up, but you didn't see people writing actual JavaScript. They were still using jQuery. And the other great thing about jQuery is it was exceptionally well documented, much more than JavaScript ever was. Like you still had that same issue where you needed a big fat textbook to tell you how to do something. And if you were using something a lot, you had sticky notes and it was just terrible. Like that's how I learned how to write HTML when I was a kid. And you had a HTML4 book that was like this big. It was huge. And that amazingly enough, there were only a handful of tags. So now that we are in a living standard and there's like way more semantic tags available, you just can't do books anymore. Like you need something that can be indexed and queried and is easy for someone to interact with. Um, so I think JavaScript was kind of inching its way towards that. And by the time I started working for a company called Boyd Gaming, they were really trying to replace all of their Flash assets with things that people could use on their phone. All media, all devices. So I started using jQuery heavily on that. I actually did one project for them where I rewrote a map of all their properties. So you had a map of the US, and you click on one of the states that they had a property in, and I utilized a library called Cell for the slideshow components, and everything else was just jQuery. And that used DOM manipulation, so you had to have a representation of the DOM already rendered and there on the server from the server, and then and you had to do all sorts of wacky things too. Like, if you wanted to load a bunch of images, you wouldn't just load all the images in the DOM. That'd be insane. It would take forever. So you would end up loading like an unordered list with a bunch of list items. And the list items in HTML5, you have data attributes that you prefix to put custom things in. So you do like data image, and then using jQuery, you would find that attribute on that element, loop through it, pull the image out, preload a certain number. So it was kind of fun. It took me back to the idea of Flash, but it was a little bit more rewarding, but it was still a very arduous task. Like it took a long time to write things.
What do you think of what I refer to as the Framework of the Month Club? Because as you've mentioned, there were before jQuery, there was Prototype and Scriptaculous. There was
Hmm.
jQuery, which was a lot better than both of those put together. And there were
Yep.
just a number of other frameworks that would come out by these groups that uh, basically their philosophy of web design, these frameworks espoused that philosophy, and there were people drawn to those, but I don't know that they were always necessarily better. But it just seems like there's an unending, whatever the hottest thing is doesn't stay hot long enough for somebody to stay comfortable with it, or maybe it does. What's your opinion?
Well, to any degree, all technology has obsolescence baked into the model. Like we could talk about like agriculture, right? As an invention, agriculture was a really hot thing, but they didn't have irrigation, so it didn't have a lot of range, right?
Sure, sure. But your dad's a COBOL programmer. How much of that
Hmm.
kind of thing did he see in his career, do you suppose?
I don't think so. Yeah, because I mean, COBOL is like it's like a zombie language when you think about it. It's been 1959 is a good run. I mean,
Yeah.
no one's using Fortran anymore.
Oh, that's not
Um,
true. That's not true. We,
well,
we we should do a whole show on this. That's not true.
oh, I'd love to hear that. But yeah, COBOL is still around, and it's funny because I'll talk with my dad about like certain things, and he's like, "Oh yeah, how big of a check did you write for IBM?" And I'm like, "I don't know. I'm not responsible for that." But those were things that he brought up, and I could talk with a COBOL developer today, and it's basically the same thing.
Yeah,
Um,
that was kind of the point that I was getting to is not it seems like frameworks for not just JavaScript, but for a lot of
yeah.
different web development tools, they seem to come and go very quickly, quicker than I would have imagined.
Well,
20,
that's a
20 years
yeah.
ago, I wouldn't have imagined this kind of churn in that sort of tech. So I'm just
Oh
curious as
yeah.
to your opinion there.
Well, so yeah, there is a lot of churn. That's one of the problems of having a living standard and having your code run on somebody else's computer. It's like the computers are always advancing, they're always changing. And the thing about JavaScript libraries is that they're there, they always have been there to do uh, to do what is not natively capable, right? So when we talk about semantics, right, we also need to talk about what is readily available as a component, as a function, as anything in the client, right? So a great example, drop downs, right? We use them all the time on websites. The select component or select element, I should say, uh, in web sucks. You can't customize it. You can't change the colors. You can't make it all fancy. And that's what UX designers like, and that's what users like. They like big fancy drop downs that have icons in them, and you can click on them, and they do a fancy dance or whatever. Like there's a manner of interaction with that. But the problem with that is usually it's not accessible, right? Like you go into W3C and you look at the specification, there is an outline of how uh, elements that fit a particular semantic role should work. And that means that you, as the author of that element, need to adhere to those requirements so they satisfy all users, like limited mobility. I can navigate; it's navigable with the keyboard, or it has the right assertive roles for someone who's using screen readers, right?
Sure. You're talking
The
about the
same thing
ADA
goes
requirements.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're talking about WAI, ARIA, and WCAG, right? Um, a lot of junior developers don't realize that you have to adhere to those requirements. Like they put it in and they like yeah, click, it works. Okay, I'm done. It takes a lot of time to write a custom select menu. So what do you do? How do you make up that time? You use a library. The problem is with JavaScript now is more people are using JavaScript, not jQuery, JavaScript, because they are building in Node and they use compilers to compile down their code to different compliant formats. Like you have right now, you can do CommonJS, right? That's what runs in most browsers. A lot of things, or UMD is another thing. But browsers are beginning to ratify things like modules, and therein lies the churn, right? The browsers are adopting more features that developers want natively in these applications. But the problem with the libraries is they exist solely to shim or polyfill or provide some sort of stopgap that prevents you from having to completely reinvent the wheel every time you want to implement a feature. And that's why there are so many web libraries, is because the web is constantly changing. Like I remember when I first started working with React, you couldn't use object methods in the browser. Like if you did like something really simple, like which is hilarious because JavaScript is a language of objects. Everything is an object, everything. Uh, the idea that maybe, okay, I got this JSON response coming back from the server and it's a flat object, and I want to split that up to where I could iterate over the values of that object. Object.values, pretty simple, right? Well, that was not supported by all browsers back in the day. It is now. And there are resources that you can use to determine whether or not you should polyfill your build. Like Can I Use is pretty popular. But the thing to remember is all these libraries, they are around to provide a consistent experience for the user and prevent you from having to spend more time than you need to implement a feature that is not widely supported. That's why you got them all. But the thing that kind of bugs me now, that we talk about libraries and that like there's libraries everywhere. Like React in and of itself is a library, but it's a library that does two things: components and state. That's all it does. Like you don't get anything else. So it's on you to know HTML, it's on you to know CSS, it's on you to know JavaScript to really get
So
things working there.
so where does TypeScript fit into this picture? Or does it?
Uh, well, I mean, it does. So funny enough, TypeScript is like, JavaScript, one of the big criticisms of it is it does not have a typing system, right? And things have very simple primitive types. Like you have strings, numbers, null, objects, functions, arrays, things like that. And if you boil things down to their rudiments, right? Pretty much everything's like either one of those primitives or a generator function. But it kind of sucks when you're working with methods, right? You know, any sort of uh, programming paradigm, object-oriented, functional, reactive. You need to know what input and output are. Like, what are your expected arguments? And JavaScript doesn't give that to you. It doesn't tell you what you need to supply as arguments. It doesn't tell you what this is. It doesn't indicate what the lexical scoping is. Um, you have to debug it. Like if you go into the browser console and the big thing that I see from a lot of early people just getting started with JavaScript is that they just don't understand lexical scoping, or purity in functions or things like that. Uh, it's kind of hard to understand. So TypeScript is like a subset of JavaScript. It's a strictly typed subset where you can define the interfaces and kind of more well define those arguments. And that kind of lives in your code base. It doesn't run in the browser, it never will. Uh, and it does require a compiler. And that's the other thing that kind of TypeScript has going for it. It's like, you talk about library fatigue. Right now, I'm going through compiler fatigue. There's like a million compilers. It used to be that you had like Gulp or Broccoli. Now you have Webpack, Bun, Rollup, Vite, which is just a extension of Rollup. TypeScript's kind of stood the test of time there. Personally, I like to consider myself a classical JavaScript developer. Like I like things like coercion and loose types. Um, but I really love a well-documented code base as well. So I prefer to use something called JS doc, which is native, and your IDE will pick up on it. You can actually output declarations as well for your libraries from it. So you kind of have a choice. And TypeScript isn't the only one. There's a few other typing subsets that are out there, but TypeScript by and large has the largest user base. So thereby, convention alone, it wins. But I think it's a really fascinating concept, especially when you start talking about JavaScript doing things on the back end, right? There, personally, I don't think JavaScript is quite ready for the back end, um, just because it's expensive. You know,
How so?
uh, well, it's not efficient. Like it just doesn't work as efficiently on the back end. But you can work fast in JavaScript. That's the other thing. If iteration is very important to you, and time to market is very important to you, and having a single team that can do absolutely everything in one language, go for JavaScript. But if you're looking for long-term maintenance and reducing maintenance costs, JavaScript running on the back end is very expensive just by the way that it through threading and how async operations work. It can be pretty cumbersome. And you also have to remember that there is a compilation process as well that you have to go through and make sure that it's working. It's funny because there's like, for me, when libraries have gotten to such a high churn rate that they've become political, there is a political aspect to how libraries are implemented. A good example is React versus Angular versus Vue versus Ember, right? Like there's a lot to choose from, but React itself, by and large, is the largest front end library out there right now. Like it's everywhere. But the problem is, React is owned by Meta, used to be Facebook, right? And
Yep.
the they maintained it for the longest time, but they did it in a really cool way. Like they built it, but they also had a group that just played with it, right? Like they made sure that the developer experience with React was really phenomenal. And that's one of the things that drew me to learning React is that I could branch out into areas like test-driven development or behavior-driven development, where I'm actually testing my code and getting the assurance that I want that my code's working properly. And I have all these different libraries that could support that flow. But now you got companies like Next and Remix, which are heavy players in React. Like they influence a lot of the intake from React. And these, React is now going into its 19th version. There have been several versions where they just completely boil the ocean. Like when React 16 came out, there were hooks. And everyone had learned React as a class, like everything was inherited, all your state, everything was inherited from a class. But that was a problem because you couldn't exchange stateful logic very easily between components without using something like a higher order component or a weird library like reflow. So they implemented hooks, and that was based off of the demand of the development community to create things that in a much more modular structure. Now you see these big frameworks like Next or Remix, which are really designed to make React a valid server language. Like you can render your markup on the server in React, but the code writes completely different between client and server. So how do you make sure that you have one set of paradigms that you use between the client and server? Use a framework. So Next and Remix influence React's ability to operate in that framework. And you have all these people who are loyalists, all these developers who have become very loyal to Next and Remix because it solves those problems for them. But in a very limited fashion, right? If you want to use Next, you have to work with its routing paradigms. Whereas if you were just using React, you could choose your own routing paradigms. And that was one of the things that I really liked about React is it was customizable and you could fit it to your project and everything. Those bolt-on libraries, they depended on React for state and component bindings, but it didn't necessarily require you to learn other paradigms. Like how do you do client-side routing? How do you manage state? How do you do all these things? These were all problems that you could work out with your team and come up with an agreement. Like this is the best state model for our front-end architecture. This is the best routing structure for our front ends. And there was this great article on a website called CSS Tricks, called The Great Divide, when React was becoming really popular. Is it talked about like that idea between front-end developers being more of front end is more of an art, right? You're talking about interpreted languages, things being pixel perfect, being able to understand and realize how things display on the screen. But React requires someone with a computer science background to really get in there and know what they're doing. You need to know how the server is executing requests. You need to know how those requests go between the browser and the server. You need to have all of these other skills in your tool belt, but you also need to be a front-end developer. And there was a divide between those skill sets. And that divide did not go anywhere, in my opinion. It just, React increased the abstractions by introducing component libraries, which again are a double-edged sword. It's really nice because you can build something quickly. And I built a component library for FNBO as well, right? Like that was my crowning achievement. I really wanted to build one. So I built one that consistently abstracted all of our design requirements into the whole design system into a set of modular bespoke components. And it was kind of inspired by this other library called Material UI React. But the problem with that is now you are just working in one system. It is all just JavaScript. and you lose focus on the fundamentals of what constructs that web page, which is semantics. So we've completely pushed people who were in front of the front end out into their own segment, or it's been completely replaced by tools that convert designs into markup. You know, so I think to some degree libraries have been detrimental because they shift the focus away from the fundamental requirements of building good web applications. And they do it all for the sake of efficiency, and it limits the idea of experimentation and understanding. And that kind of bugs me, because the whole point is just to make things work cross browser, make your job easier, make your life easier. But where's the fun? How are you going to have a blast anymore? Like, crack open a website and figure out how to make the browser shake. I don't see a lot of people doing that anymore. That's actually kind of why I did that. I built a synthesizer using React just recently. With all these advancements, I think around 2000, it was around 2016, I think the web audio API became fully ratified and had a lot of good cross-browser support. And the web audio API is really interesting because it is all the rudiments that you would get with the digital audio workstation. You have all these construction things that you can construct sound sources from, like oscillators and filters and really fun things like that. And I just got lately I've been kind of moody about like this, oh, it's the next way or it's no way. You can't use a spread operator. That's a funny thing. Like if you want to impress a JavaScript developer or make them laugh, just be like, huh, are you using a spread operator? Because apparently you're not allowed to do that anymore, which is bad because I mean most of my code, like, I prefer inheritance and substitution. So if I don't have to worry about a particular thing in an object, I'm going to spread it. It's the easiest way to do it, but a lot of developers are up in arms, like don't use spread operators, and especially in tight loops. And they'll introduce all these different concepts.
Yeah, not keying
So,
in on that in particular, but things that were perfect that worked perfectly well years ago are now anti-patterns. So you just have to
yep.
get used to that. That's also something that has a pretty high churn rate.
Oh yeah. I mean, well, it's funny because at a certain point you got to think like, okay, when does the code become fun again? When does it become understandable? Like, not everything has to be a challenge. If you can read code and it's well documented and you know what it does, that's fantastic. You can build it and expand on it and abstract things from it. It's really fun. I love JavaScript just because of its modular nature. You can just, oh, you need this function to do another thing. Well, you need that function to do the same thing. Let's just abstract it out into its own function. Test it, funny enough. So if you change something, the test break, hey, you now have assurance that your code's working properly. And that's why I like JavaScript now, is kind of reached that maturity threshold where things are observable and pretty easy to interpret. Like back in the day, JavaScript, it was like you wrote it, it worked, wing in a prayer, go to prod. Um, and now, I'm pretty happy with our code bases. Like, you know, my team is really big into behavior driven development, domain driven development. We have a lot of our code bases at 100% coverage, and that's fantastic. You know, yeah, you got to understand what the code is doing, right? It's all input and output. So if you're able to cover a branch or statement and you understand how to do it, fantastic. And we're always learning more, right? Because I is that whole concept again. It's like, where's the fun come into it? Well, if you have fun everywhere you go, things are going to suck a lot less. And I think that's my general philosophy from just working in front end development for so long and seeing all of these fads and all of these things kind of go away. It's like even with Flash, like Flash was terrible, but it was also really cool. And when we got rid of Flash, there were all these different things that were stopgaps to convince people that it was better. Like was a flat design was a big thing when Flash was killed because they were like, we can't get all these weird skeuomorphic designs to work on a phone. Let's just let's just make it unpopular, you know.
Yes,
Yeah. So I think that's kind of it's hilarious, but you kind of got to keep your eye on the prize. It's about really advancing your skills and just focus on making it fun for yourself. You know, things are
sure.
going to change all the time, and you can appreciate things that are old. Like, I think that's another thing to comments. No one's forcing you to use a new library. You should use a new library because it benefits you in some way, and it has some staying power, and maybe it's easy to replace if you ever need to.
Sure. So what's on the horizon now for Gunnar Gustafson?
Um, there's so much change. I just kind of roll with it. I'm more so focused on being a dad than anything. Like that's the most important thing for me. But I take that dad mentality and I apply it to everywhere. Like I want to be a mentor. I talked at a few conventions last year, right? That was entertaining because you got a chance to see people light up and like one of the cool things that I achieved at FNBO is that micro front end architecture. Everyone loves it. It's like the hot topic. And being able to talk with people and introduce that idea to them, that was really rewarding. And I really like working with junior developers. I consider myself quite passionate about giving them the leg up I never had, right? It was very challenging for me to get my career on the right path. It was always challenging for me to even get like through school. Like it wasn't nothing seemed like it was built for me. So I have a real soft spot for people trying to get into the industry and just don't know how to approach it. It's challenging. You don't even know who to talk to or who to network. You're expected to be all these things that you're not, that you aren't. And I like to impress people with the idea that you can be who you are. You can be happy. You can have fun. You can make decisions, and those decisions matter to you, right? Like I just kind of consider myself semi-disruptive, but I still like to go along with it, and I love to help people. I love to solve problems, and that's what it's about. If I were to go back to school, though, I'd probably go back to school for electronic engineering because I'm still a tinkerer, you know. So yeah, I don't think if I were to ever switch career paths, I don't know if I'd still go into software. Maybe DSP. That's really fascinating. But I still love the old analog stuff, and who knows, maybe that's just me working in JavaScript for so long and having library fatigue. I want to go back to things that just use electricity, you
There
know?
you go.
Yeah.
Huh? You can take up a
So,
Fortran job too.
oh yeah, fantastic. I'll get the check ready for IBM.
Well, Gunnar, this has been a great conversation. I really enjoyed having you on. We'll have to have you back on because I think there's probably a number of topics we could discuss.
Oh yeah, I could talk your ear off about synthesizers. That's how I lost a lot of girlfriends, funny enough.
Okay. Well, thank you
All
again for
right.
your time. This has been great.
Fantastic, Jim. You have a good night, all right?
Yep, you too. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Let's do this again soon. Take care.